Hi, thanks for joining us for episode 3 on how to grow a monster tomato. As you can see, we're well out the top of our 10-foot tomato frame. Because we bury it at 1.5 feet in the ground, we're approaching 9 feet tall, and we're about 2/3 of the way through the season. The tomato plant is not only that tall, but it's also full of fruit all the way through. So this frame is actually supporting quite a lot of weight. As we move this direction, if you recall from the previous video where we talked about the drawbacks of using a 30-inch tomato frame like this one, which is the typical size, I told you that you would need to cut back and tame that tomato plant to make it stay. And you can see that I've snipped off some of the growth. But I also left some to show you as they grow out the top and the fruit sets, the branches begin to lay over, and as these get larger and heavier, these branches will bend and they will eventually break, and a lot of that fruit may not ripen. So creating a frame at the very beginning to support the tomato plant that we want to grow is really important. So one of the things that happens when you've got a tomato plant that's well over 10 feet tall, that has hundreds of pounds of tomatoes on it, especially in the summertime in North America, we get thunderstorms occasionally, and that wind has actually been known to buckle these completely over. So I've learned a couple of things. The first one is, as you'll see, I've placed this somewhat close to a fence that will help break some of that wind and prevent some of that. But the other thing I've learned is this concept of, it's almost like putting a backbone into the tomato frame. So I've got a 10-foot piece of rebar, and if your tomato plant is getting this big and you're concerned about it, you can buy this at any hardware store. And you take this piece of rebar and you actually weave it through the bars all the way down and then drive it into the ground. And this acts like a spine just to keep that tomato frame solid and prevent it from bending too much or actually breaking over in the wind. You don't have to use two. If you were worried about a lot of wind, or if you didn't have any kind of a fence, you could actually put a piece of rebar on either side. If you prefer not to weave it through, you could run it along and then either wire it to the frame or zip tie it to the frame on either side, but think of it as a backbone, just keeping everything rock solid. Also, if you plan on trying to go beyond the 10-foot tall and you know, put two tomato frames together, then I strongly recommend that you use a couple of pieces of rebar, because as you approach 15, 18, 20 feet tall, they become very, very heavy and very susceptible to blowing over in the wind. One of the things that's happened this year is you all have been growing your own monster tomatoes. I've been getting emails and questions asking, what is the secret in Tomato Secret, Joss? And we always laugh because it's proprietary, we can't tell you, but I will let you in on a little bit of the secret. One of the ingredients that we add is a metabolite. It's not a hormone in the truest sense, but we think of it as a secondary metabolite. And this all-natural certified organic ingredient actually tells the plant to grow, grow, grow. And it's important that you put the nutrients there to support that growth, because that metabolite by itself doesn't actually provide any nutrition. It just encourages the plant to eat. And so that particular ingredient, when you apply in a top dress fashion, it takes about 3 days for it to work its way into the system and be fully active. And then it's active in that plant for about 10 or 11 days. So every 2 weeks is what we recommend for the side dress, just to keep it in that cycle. That metabolite, not only does it encourage it to grow, but it also encourages it to flower and to fruit, which are, of course, all things that we want to do with Tomato Secret. Now, we've talked about that secondary metabolite that tells the plant to grow, grow, grow. But the other real common question is, what else is in Tomato Secret? And so I'm going to pour some out here for you to take a look at. And what you'll see is a lot of material that actually doesn't look like fertilizer at all. And that's one of the secrets on how we put tomato secret down without worrying about it burning, is it actually isn't fertilizer just yet. These materials have to be digested by bacteria in the soil to be readily available to the tomato plant. So we put this product down, and there's a constant cycle of the bacteria breaking it down, making it available to the tomato plant, and it's part of the magic. All of these ingredients, with the exception of our secret metabolite, these are all ingredients that exist at our family's feed mill. You could theoretically open this bag up and feed it to a cow, and while it would be fantastic steak, it would be very, very expensive because this is not a cheap way to feed a cow. It's just a very inexpensive way to feed a tomato. When we added up all of the cost of the individual ingredients, if you were to buy them yourself and then try to piece them together in a ratio that Grandma Z figured out a long time ago, then you would have 4 or 5 times the cost of a bag of Tomato Secret invested in trying to rebuild this product. So it's one of those neat, unique, simple products that just works. As you can see, there's plenty of ripe tomatoes starting at the bottom, working their way up. These were the first ones to set. We've been eating tomatoes for a couple of weeks now. These are early girls, so these are the ones that we actually get to have BLTs earlier in the season. And I got a question, ironically, from my wife, who has a couple of tomato plants at her office, and she works with children. And one of the things they've been doing this summer is they have a garden there and some tomato plants. And while her tomatoes look very healthy and they're tall, some of her new tomatoes were developing a rotten spot on the bottom, and she couldn't understand what was causing it. And what is the cause of that is actually inconsistent watering. We call that condition blossom end rot, and you'll see a lot of people talk about added calcium to prevent blossom end rot. But the reality is, when the water is inconsistent, it inhibits the plant's ability to absorb calcium, and applying a foliar calcium to the tomato plant is really just a Band-Aid to help you solve the inconsistent watering problem, which really is easier to solve by watering consistently. On this tomato, you can still see the blossom is attached to the bottom of this particular piece of fruit, and that end is the one that turns brown in blossom end rot. It turns out, when I started asking more questions, her tomato plants were planted in a pot on the hot side of the building, and they would water them on Friday before the weekend, and then by Monday, when they came in the morning, the tomatoes were all wilted over. They had gotten too dry. And then they would water them, and they would perk right back up. And while they weren't dying and they were still growing, they were getting blossom end rot. So we solved that problem with consistent watering. And if you still have an issue, we have a foliar calcium product, but I strongly recommend you try to solve it with the water first. Kids all over the world are worried about monsters eating them. And in this particular case, the question is, what's eating my monster? And you'll see I've got a leaf here that has some holes in it. And there are a number of things that will eat a tomato plant in your yard. The key thing is to take a look at the damage, take one of the leaves itself. Sometimes you can take that into a garden center in your area and they can diagnose specifically what bugs might be eating it, or you can become a detective, and that's my favorite thing to do. One of the things about bugs is they may be sneaky, but they're terrible liars. And when you come out, if you come out at night, maybe at 10 o'clock in the summertime, when things have started to cool down in the garden, if you look around really closely at the leaves when it's cooler, you're gonna see those guys eating. They don't get this much damage done by sleeping all day and all night. So if you come out at night, you're gonna see exactly what the bug is. And in this particular case, they were simple slugs that were eating my tomato plant. And I'm really not worried about the slugs in that they're not going to eat enough that they could kill my plant or harm it that much. But one of the things that is good about slugs is they're relatively easy to treat, because you don't have to actually spray poison on your plant, which is what I like to avoid. You can use a bait that's around the base of the plant. It attracts the slugs to it, and they eat it and they die. You just need to make sure that whenever you're spraying anything on your tomato plants or around your tomato plants, make sure that it's safe to be used in a tomato garden so that you don't take any of the poison up into your fruit. That about wraps up episode 3. Please join us again for the 4th episode. We're going to get closer to the end of the active growing season and see how tall we can get this monster to grow. But also want to encourage any of you that have questions, please continue to email me. They're giving us really good information to do in these videos and share and answer questions that probably everyone has. So thank you for those that have contributed, and bring more. We love them. See you next time.